I'm Lloyd Kramer. I'm a professor of history at UNC Chapel Hill and also the director of Carolina Public Humanities, which has organized this event. I launched our seminar yesterday with a discussion of the polarized election of 1800. And today's session of the seminar features Freddie Kiger, who will be speaking about the election of 1860. I'm again at Flyleaf Books in Chapel Hill, and my colleague Paul Bonici is managing the technology for this event, along with backup assistance from Vicki Breeden, who's over in the Carolina Public Humanities office. And I thank both Paul and Vicki for their outstanding work on this project. We're going to follow the same format today that we used yesterday. You won't be able to turn on your audio or your camera, but you will be able to send questions through the Q&A function, the tab on your Zoom screen. So feel free to ask questions during the talk and after the talk. And then I'll share those questions with Freddie after he completes his talk, and we'll continue to discuss the themes that he's going to be exploring during his presentation. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for another historical conversation. And I especially thank all of our friends and supporters who've contributed to CPH and helped to sustain our programs, especially during the current pandemic. Your support is much appreciated, and we welcome your continuing support in the days and weeks ahead. I also want to remind you that we're recording each session of this seminar, so you can go back later to review something you may want to see again, or you can watch a session that you could not see during the live Zoom broadcast. As I noted yesterday, this seminar is focusing on highly polarized American elections, and we're discussing the presidential elections of 1800, 1860, and 1968. These years stand out in American history because so many people believed in each of these periods that the Republic was in danger of falling apart. And this is actually what happened in 1860, as we're going to discuss today with Freddie Kiger. I'm very pleased to welcome Freddie to this seminar and to continue the discussion of key elections that will also extend into the 20th century elections tomorrow, when Suzanne Globetti will discuss the events of 1968. You've received a summary of Freddie Kiger's interest and career in the biographical materials that were distributed before the seminar. But I want to note just a few of his many achievements. Freddie is originally from Western North Carolina, out near Forsyth County, and he received his BA degree in history, a very wise choice, in history at UNC Chapel Hill. And then he went on to complete a Master of Arts in Teaching at UNC. And then he was a teacher in the Chapel Hill Carborough Public Schools for more than 20 years, focusing on history and especially on American history. But he also launched an important public career as a public speaker, and he became a very popular leader of programs for UNC's General Alumni Association. And Freddie has often led tours of Civil War battlefields, and he has a remarkable knowledge of this complex period of American history. In addition to his work as a public speaker and interpreter of the Civil War, Freddie has long worked for ESPN as a writer, a statistician, and sports researcher. To summarize his achievements most simply, I want to stress that Freddie Kiger knows how to collect and talk about all kinds of historical information, from sports to the Civil War. And I'm very pleased that he has joined us today to talk about another time of extreme polarization. And the title of his talk is Prelude to Disaster: The Election of 1860. Please join me in welcoming Freddie Kiger to Carolina Public Humanities. Freddie?
Lloyd, thank you so very much for that very kind introduction. I am flattered to be a part of this program and to be a part of something that is very dear to my heart. History indeed is a passion, and it is to be conveyed in a story-like form, for that is exactly what history is, a story filled with human beings who have been caught over the years and over the centuries in events and times that have held them frozen in time so that hopefully we might study and learn from them. And so, without further ado, the election of 1860. It was a Wednesday, the 18th of April, 1860, and to Charleston, South Carolina, they began to arrive. Men who hoped to nominate the next president of the United States. Their journey there had been difficult. Those that traveled by rail arrived exhausted. The delegates from Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania arrived by boat and quickly realized they were in a place that did not welcome Northern men and their ideas. Those who supported the 5'4" Stephen A. Douglas, the little giant, hoped to hammer out an inoffensive platform, then corner 2/3 of the convention vote, which would mean 202 votes of the 303 there. Confident, they were organized and believed they could control the creation process for the platform. And they were willing to dangle federal appointments to secure those who could be persuaded. But their man, as of late, had issues. His health was poor. He was financially embarrassed. And politically, he still clung to the belief that popular sovereignty and non-intervention could save a threatened union. His managers were so organized and aggressive, they unintentionally pushed Deep South delegates to extreme measures. There were other anti-Douglas men, those supportive of sitting Democratic President James Buchanan, who never forgave Douglas's break with him 2 years earlier over the Kansas territorial constitution crisis. Southern extremists included William Lowndes Yancey and Leroy P. Walker, both of Alabama, and William Barksdale of Mississippi. These men, along with the pro-Buchanan administration delegates, hoped to draft a platform Douglas would never support. Deep Southern delegates hoped the resulting chaos would break up the convention, break up the party, and pave the way for secession and an independent Southern republic. Given their mission, it is interesting to note that common folk of several Gulf states may have been Unionist and firmly believed their state elections had been rigged so that radical delegates would be sent to Charleston. Regardless, on Monday, April the 23rd, after an 11 a.m. shower, the delegates moved into South Carolina Institute Hall on Meeting Street. From the start, the structure was too small for the 3,000 who gathered. The first order of business, the important task of electing a chair. Although an anti-Douglas man, an advocate for Mississippi's Jefferson Davis, the man chosen was a delegate at large from Massachusetts, Caleb Cushing. All believed that, despite his pro-Davis stance, he was a fair man. Immediately thereafter, there was an angry discussion and decision that allowed votes to be cast individually, unless a delegation was bound by state instruction. This concerned Deep South delegates, for it meant 30 to 40 Douglas men were now freed up. The next discussion Cushing chaired related to the platform. It was decided to create the party's position before balloting for a candidate. As it turned out, that decision meant disaster for the convention, for the Little Giants delegation had pledged not to accept a platform that included a slave protection plank in the territories. Alabama and other states from the Deep South had pledged to withdraw if not. In short, long before a candidate was chosen, party unity was doomed. On the third day, a decision was made to seat one of two groups of delegates from Illinois and New York. And that decision helped Douglas, for he would gather more convention votes. On the fourth day, with proceedings handcuffed by the decision that no balloting for candidates would begin until a platform had been agreed upon, the day was spent waiting for the platform committee to complete its task. On Friday, the 27th, the city's mild weather had turned to cold rain and blustering winds. But the bad weather gave the platform committee an additional morning to complete its work. Around 12:30, the frazzled committee entered the convention hall with copies of majority and minority reports. The majority report had signatures from 15 slave states, plus Oregon and California. The majority report was a majority by a razor-thin one vote, 17 states to 16. The report's focus: Congress had no power to abolish slavery in the territories. Territorial legislatures had no power to abolish slavery or impair the right of property in slaves. The minority report reaffirmed the Democratic Party's position in 1856, which supported popular sovereignty. As might be expected, heated debate began, and it consumed the rest of the day. Eventually, two speakers proved to be the opposing lightning rods of principle. The very crises of the gathering had arrived, and it came in the human forms of Alabama's William Lowndes Yancey for the majority, and for the minority, the gentleman on the right, George E. Pugh of Ohio. Yancey thundered in his speech before the convention, "Ours is the property invaded. Ours are the institutions which are at stake. Ours is the peace that is to be destroyed. Ours is the honor at stake, the honor of children, the honor of families, the lives, perhaps of all of which rest upon what your course ultimately may make, a great heaving volcano of passion and crimes if you are unable to consummate your design. Bear with us then, if we stand sternly upon what is yet that dormant volcano, and say we yield no position here until we are convinced we are wrong." At 7 p.m. and before a packed hall, Pugh replied. His impassioned appeal hammered home with this dramatic statement: "Must the Democratic Party be dragged at the chariot wheel of 300,000 slave masters? Gentlemen of the South, you mistake us. You mistake us. We will not do it." An uproar ensued, and it poured out into the Charleston night. The next morning, Saturday the 28th, more chill and rain that had to reflect the mood inside Institute Hall. When the opening gavel fell that day, there was more wrangling over the platform, more speeches, more stormy rhetoric. It lasted all day and carried over into Sunday, after a Saturday night filled with scheming in smoky parlors, back rooms, and hotel bars. On the seventh day of the Democratic Convention, the point of no return. At 10 a.m., the platform was taken up for a vote. With great anxiety, delegates and packed galleries waited and watched. The tally, by a vote of 165 to 138, the minority report had carried. The 165 votes that embraced popular sovereignty was, from free state delegates, 154 to 30, from those representing slave states, 11, 4 to 108 against. As soon as the vote was announced, Alabamian Leroy P. Walker got the attention of Chairman Cushing and wished to make an announcement. As he moved to the front of the convention hall, a great hush fell. With dramatic pause, he gathered in all those in attendance then announced that the Alabama Convention in Montgomery had directed its delegates to withdraw if they were unable to obtain a slave code resolution. And since their demand had been denied, Alabama would follow its instructions. The Alabamians rose as one and marched out of the hall. Then the Mississippians announced they too would retire. Then the delegates from Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. Part of the Arkansas delegation joined the walkout. The Texans then en masse left. After consultation, so did Georgia. That night, as the Democratic Party tore itself asunder, Charleston was still strangely filled with celebration. Joy for many who believed that soon thereafter secession would follow and a Southern republic would be created. The next day, the 1st of May, those that remained dutifully gathered, their mood one of dejection. Even more so when they returned to find that perhaps during the night, Southern ladies had placed bouquets in the empty seats of those that had walked out the day before. Given the storm to come, those bouquets symbolic of the flowers many would bring to adorn thousands of Southern graves. Most in the convention were now quite aware that a Democrat could not win the presidency. For that matter, it would be difficult to even nominate a candidate by the required 2/3 of all elected delegates. The Northwestern Democrats, Douglas men, thought of that and wanted to amend the convention rule to 2/3 of those present, but Chairman Cushman would not allow it. With that, one participant remarked the decision sounded like clods falling on Douglas's coffin. Still, 6 men were formally nominated: Stephen A. Douglas, James Guthrie of Kentucky, R.M.T. Hunter of Virginia, Daniel S. Dickinson of New York, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, and North Carolina native Joseph Lane of Oregon. Needing 202 convention votes, on the first ballot, Douglas led with 145 1/2. The next nearest was Guthrie with 42. 12 more unsuccessful ballots followed that first day of May. There would be 45 more, a total of 57, and all unsuccessful. Stephen A. Douglas never received more than 152 1/2 votes. Hopelessly deadlocked, the decision was made to adjourn and gather 6 weeks later in Baltimore. The split party meant the Democrats of the Deep South, who had declared that they would never tolerate a Republican president, just made certain one indeed would be elected. Of course, there were those who hoped just that, force the issue. Those extremists came to Charleston, a minority in terms of the number of delegates gathered, and quite possibly in terms of the citizens they represented, yet they wanted to push their will upon the majority. They came to Charleston to voice their hatred of Republican restriction of slavery by Congress and Douglas's measure of possible restriction by popular sovereignty. Simply put, they succeeded. 2 weeks later, their political rivals, the Republicans, gathered in Chicago. With the news from Charleston, delegates arrived, glowing with confidence. Running in only its second presidential election, the party's frontrunner for nomination was New York's William Henry Seward. He had solid governmental experience. He was a long-time disciple of the free soil clause and cause. Yet the lower north and border states, those delegates from those two areas feared he was devious and too radical. One powerful editor, Horace Greeley, agreed. From Missouri came a possible nominee, Edward Bates. But Greeley felt Bates was the only man who could carry the lower North and border states. Bates was relatively soft on slavery. He was safe, tactful, a strong unionist. Several believed he could capture some Southern votes in Western Virginia, Western North Carolina, or Eastern Tennessee. Yet, he was little known in the East, and some remembered he once used the issue of slavery as an explosive whip to keep him in office. Also, his support of the anti-foreign Know-Nothing Party, the American Party, in 1856 alienated German Americans and Northeasterners who wanted a strong anti-slavery man. In short, the two, Seward and Bates, were vulnerable. Seward looked risky in conservative northern states, and Bates in those where views were more radical. It seemed the more well-known a candidate was, the more baggage he carried. And so, others were suggested, like Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania, who had the support of the New York Herald, strong-stomached Pennsylvanians, and tariff protectionists everywhere. However, many thought of him a crass businessman, a turncoat, and a Pennsylvania machine politician. Most Ohioans stood either behind smooth Salmon Chase or rough-hewn, coarse Benjamin Wade. Nationally, former Whigs did not like cold, calculating, and selfish Chase, who was once a Democrat. Wade, a blustering egomaniac, possessed genuine ability, but was far too caustic for the statesmanship required of a chief executive. Then, oh yes, there was another, an Illinois favorite son who saw opportunity in Chicago, Abraham Lincoln. Our popular image is the self-made man coming into his own at the Chicago Convention. Nothing could be farther from the truth. If you remember, he had been nominated in 1856 for the party's vice presidential slot. Since, Lincoln and his handlers targeted Chicago, and he labored for the opportunity. Back in 1859, he paid his dues when he traveled some 4,000 miles, delivering 23 speeches for Republican candidates. He wrote numerous letters, and in response, Lincoln clubs were established in January of 1860. His friends, prepping for Chicago, asked the ambitious Lincoln if he would be available for the vice presidential position. His answer? A firm no. And why should he be? For as early as February the 16th, the Chicago Tribune editorially endorsed him for president. The paper reasoned he would be an excellent middle ground candidate between frontrunners Seward and Bates. And so, Mr. Lincoln stayed busy. He seized chances to create a buzz for himself in the East. His Cooper Union address in New York City gathered attention. Then, ostensibly to visit his son Robert, who was attending Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, he made speeches in New Haven, Hartford, Providence, and Concord. During each address, Lincoln reinforced that slavery should first be restricted and left alone where it already existed. In his mind, one small step at a time. As much as the Cooper Union address was an electric moment for Lincoln, there was another, just as dramatic, and it came at the Illinois Republican State Convention on the 8th of May, 1860. Richard J. Oglesby, a Mexican War veteran and 49er, wanted the convention to have a touch of campaigning, if you will, like the days of Old Hickory and Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. He chatted up John Hanks, who had worked with Lincoln when the two cleared land. In their conversation, rail splitting came up. Hanks took him to an old fence some 12 miles east of Decatur, Illinois, where they plucked up two rails that Hanks identified as those he and Lincoln had split. With them, Oglesby planned to formulate a convention moment. It came during the Republican State Convention, where some 3,000 men and 600 delegates had gathered. At the appropriate moment, he had delegates hoist Lincoln, all 6'4" of him, above their heads, and he was hand passed aloft all the way to the speaker's platform from where he took his seat. At that precise moment, entering from the back of the hall, bearded old John Hanks and another pioneer moved down the center aisle. In their hands, they carried the two weather-beaten rails that had been found, bedecked with a flag and a banner that read, "Abraham Lincoln, the rail candidate for president in 1860. Two rails from a lot of 3,000 made in 1830 by John Hanks and Abe Lincoln, whose father was the first pioneer of Macon County." The place exploded. The uproar lasted some 15 minutes. Ogilvy's move was right out of campaigning days from Jackson and William Henry Harrison. And on the wave of that emotion, the Illinois State Republican Convention instructed its delegates to the National Convention to vote as a unit for their rail splitter. And that Republican National Convention was to meet here, in the so-called wigwam at the corner of Market and Lake Streets. On the avenues in and around the temporary structure, there were bands and constant parades. Everywhere, managers wooed, intimidated, bargained, maneuvered, tried to outmaneuver, bluffed and swapped favors and votes. And it wasn't only free states that sent delegates for the slaveholding border states of Kentucky, Maryland, and Virginia were there. Even a bogus 6 who claimed to be from Texas. But there was not one delegate from North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, or Florida. At noon on Wednesday, the 16th of May, the Republican National Convention convened, and it did so with great enthusiasm. The energy, unbelievable. 1,000 delegates, 10,000 spectators. The next day, Thursday, the 17th, the platform was adopted, and unlike the Democrats, it was done with expediency. Free homesteads, tariff revision, internal improvements, a Pacific Railroad, daily overland mail, internal improvements, and the immediate entry of Kansas as a free state and no extension of slavery. On Friday, nominations were to be made, and William Henry Seward expected victory. The gavel opened the session at 10. The wigwam packed since 9 that morning. 233 votes were needed to secure Republican nomination. And aware of careful staging, Lincoln's manager, David Davis, wanted to top Seward's gallery, and so he printed up 1,000 counterfeit tickets and distributed them to Lincoln supporters. Despite his efforts, the night before, Lincoln warned Davis and his floor managers, "Make no contracts that will bind me." However, on the convention floor, Davis told his people, "Lincoln ain't here and he don't know what we got to deal with." Reportedly, the biggest promises were to key figures from swing states like Illinois, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. It was rumored Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania and Caleb Smith of Indiana were promised cabinet positions. When time for nominations came round, Seward was nominated first, Lincoln second, William L. Dayton of New Jersey third, then Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania, John McLean of Ohio, and fellow Buckeye Salmon Chase. At high noon, the balloting began. First ballots included several favorite sons, so most expected a second or third ballot before a nomination was secured. Sure enough, no one got the required 233 after the first ballot. Top two, Seward with 173 1/2 votes, then Lincoln with 102. The drama began with the second ballot. Most of Cameron's delegates switched to Lincoln. Vermont's favorite son, Jacob Collamer, released his 10 votes to Lincoln. 6 came from the Chase and McLean camps. In that second vote, Seward's people had to have felt sick as they sensed their man's momentum had stalled, for his numbers in that second ballot had only increased by 11 votes. He now had 184 and a half, but Lincoln's tally had grown to 181. The third ballot began immediately, but only 4 roll call states in, Massachusetts changed 4 of its votes from Seward to Lincoln. Then the avalanche began. Rhode Island gave Lincoln 2 new votes. New Jersey gave him 8. Pennsylvania added 4. Maryland gave 9. And as the third ballot neared completion, Lincoln now had 231 and a half votes to Seward's 180. Then, Ohio's chairman jumped to his feet and announced that 4 had changed their ballot in his delegation to Lincoln. Then came pandemonium. None of the 40,000 in or out ever forgot the scene. As one put it, imagine all the hogs ever slaughtered in Cincinnati giving their death squeals together. A score of big steam whistles going. A herd of buffaloes or lions could not have made a more tremendous roaring. The Republicans had their man. Now, staged between the Democratic and Republican conventions, and with a platform that hoped to gather those caught in the middle, the Constitutional Union Party held their convention back on May the 9th. They gathered in Baltimore. Most came from the slaveholding border states. The majority, old-time Whigs. So up in years that other parties called the Constitutional Unionists the Old Gentleman's Party. Those that gathered believed that just as Douglas had split the Democrats, so front-running Seward would divide the Republicans when they gathered. The southern wing of the Constitutional Unionists wanted to nominate Sam Houston. Northerners wanted a veteran Whig. But despite the differences, it didn't take long. On the second ballot, 64-year-old John Bell of Tennessee, and for vice president, 67-year-old Edward Everett of Massachusetts were nominated. The two, intellectually solid, but they inspired few. Bell, a large slaveholder who was a nationalist, was conservative in thought. Though he had years of experience, he was overshadowed by the gifted orator Everett. Their platform, a solid stand behind the Constitution, the Union, and its laws. Safe, solid, but given the troubled times, the party's platform seemed insanely naive. Their planks better suited for an election in 1824 rather than 1860. But they were not the only ones with unsettled issues. As the Democrats returned to their homes after the debacle in Charleston, they came home to a citizenry that included Unionists. Remember that many from the Gulf states felt they had been hoodooed in their state's election process for delegates to attend the first convention, and many worried the same thing was about to occur for the second. When asked, one of the moderates, Georgia's Alexander Stephens, was asked, "What do you think of matters now?" And he answered, "That men will be cutting one another's throats in a little while. In less than 12 months we shall be in a war, and that the bloodiest in history." He urged Southern Democratic extremists to drop their slave code plank when the party reconvened in Baltimore. He urged unity. Yet, as he soon learned, that seemed impossible, for Northern Democrats were still angry over what they felt had been party treason, and Southern fire eaters were equally angry over what they perceived as threats to their regional security. Indeed, Stephens spoke for quite a few who wanted Democrats to return to Baltimore and select a compromise candidate. And yet, As the time neared for that gathering, there were troubling questions. Would the people of the Deep South want to be represented yet again by the bolters, those that had walked out? Would new state elections return the same delegates? 8 slave states had walked out of Charleston. 7 slave states stayed put. The majority of common folk in those that remained, and many in those that left, wanted healing. And as it turned out, 7 of the 8 states that walked out returned the very same delegates to Baltimore. South Carolina did not, but it sent its delegates to Richmond, where an all-Southern convention was planned. Louisiana, Alabama, Texas, Georgia, and Florida sent delegates to both Richmond and Baltimore. Douglas men in no way wanted the bolters back. In their minds, those delegates walked out and should not be reseated. New delegates should replace them. So, swimming in all this turmoil, the Democrats tried again. It was June 18th, a Monday, and the party convened at the Front Street Theater in Baltimore. Again, Caleb Cushing was selected chairman. As soon as the convention opened, a resolution was introduced to reseat all the delegates from Charleston, which was met with a mixture of hisses and cheers. It was an ominous start. 3 hours later, and with no decision made, the first session adjourned at 5 p.m. Meanwhile, Northeastern Democrats pushed a compromise slate of candidates. Perhaps moderates Horatio Seymour of New York and Georgia's Alexander Stephens. But that was not well received. The Second Democratic National Convention began badly, and it got worse the next day. With each session, angry exchanges were the norm. On Thursday the 21st, the Credentials Committee decided to exclude those from Louisiana and Alabama that bolted in Charleston. Georgia's delegates were divided evenly between those that walked out and those that were new. Arkansas would have a few new delegates, and the original delegates from Texas and Mississippi would be eligible. It was about this time a letter arrived from Stephen A. Douglas pleading for unity. And if his candidacy created division, he asked that Alexander Stephens be nominated. But it was too late. The bitterness ran too deep. So deep that during the session, a delegate from Virginia monotonously began chanting, "Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President." He continued until finally recognized. When given the floor, he, in measured words, announced that most of his delegation would leave. What followed was a silence that roared, a border state leaving the convention. Then, 16 of 20 North Carolinians announced they would follow. Tennessee announced it would retire to caucus, but hinted that it would probably not return. California and Oregon left. Kentucky and Missouri wanted time to caucus. 16 of 22 from Massachusetts left the floor to consult. The party that returned to Baltimore to hopefully find middle ground failed miserably. Anticlimactically, on June the 23rd, with many absent, Stephen A. Douglas and Georgia's Herschel V. Johnson were nominated by a party that had no semblance of national unity. Meanwhile, those that bolted or were denied seats met at noon on the same day that Douglas was nominated. 231 delegates from 19 states gathered at the Maryland Institute, where Alabama fire eater Yancey prevailed yet again. A protective slave code was adopted, and on the very first ballot, a very reluctant John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky and Oregon's Joseph Lane were nominated. Breckinridge, the current vice president and President of the Senate, was not yet 40 years of age, but was well known. His grandfather had been Attorney General under Thomas Jefferson. He stood over 6 feet tall, commanding presence, and though impressive in his carriage, he lacked originality in thought. But with his and Lane's nomination, the major slates were now complete. The Republicans, Abraham Lincoln and Maine's Hannibal Hamlin. For the Northern Democrats, Illinois' Stephen A. Douglas and Georgia's Herschel V. Johnson. For the Southern Democrats, Kentucky's John C. Breckinridge and Joseph Lane. And the Constitutional Unionists, John Bell and Edward Everett. With 303 electoral votes, 152 were required for election. For an election and vote that, like the nation, would be divided. In the South, the two-horse race would be between Bell and Breckinridge, and in the North, between Douglas and Lincoln. As the campaign began, Lincoln's Springfield, Illinois was inundated. He was hailed as the common man, the rail splitter, the common man who was self-made. And like the others, Lincoln made no speeches. But in doing so, his silence encouraged attacks which targeted him as an enemy of the South. No matter. He refused to answer any letters from strangers, and particularly from strangers about political matters. He, like most in the North, did not truly grasp the depth of Southern fears and their threats of secession. He, like most, thought those threats were merely cries of wolf. And so he spent the summer of 1860 in the governor's room of the Illinois State House. There, he consistently refused to make any concession. Particularly, he stood by the plank that slavery could remain where it existed, but would not be allowed to expand. His party ran a well-oiled machine, so efficient that it frightened Southerners. Many believed if Lincoln won, it would be only a matter of time before slavery was not only restricted, but abolished. And indeed, there was some truth to that. In the Constitutional Union camp, Bell and Everett were lone cries from the political wilderness. Their party generated little enthusiasm. Now, in truth, most were certain amongst the Constitutional Unionists that they could not win, but their mission was to carry or weaken Lincoln in the lower tier of northern states, thus deny him an electoral majority. To aid in that pursuit, the Constitutional Unionists tried fusion politics. For example, in New Jersey, there was a fusion of Breckinridge, Bell, and Douglas supporters. And in New York, Constitutional Unionists fused with Douglas. Each combination hoped to nix Lincoln's election. Their strength was in the border states, amongst those who saw themselves caught politically and quite possibly militarily in the middle. In the end, a vote for the Bell-Everett ticket was a vote against disunion. The Southern Democrats had their own dilemma, for Breckinridge was not closely identified with Southern slave code extremists. Sadly, he realized he ran on a platform committed to breaking up the Union. Astutely, Stephen A. Douglas observed that not all of Breckinridge's followers were secessionists, but every secessionist was a Breckinridge man. Like the Republicans, Southern Democrats would not concede on platform issues. They hoped to carry all the slave states, win California and Oregon. And if so, Breckinridge would have 127 of 152 electoral votes, needing only 25 amongst the free states. One Southerner, a deep Southerner, the senator of Mississippi, Jefferson Davis, also, like the Constitutional Unionists, supported fusion politics. Perhaps New York's Horatio Seymour, a man devoted to the Union and relatively free from political baggage that might be named about him. And so Davis supported this fusion party. Again, the fervent hope of fusion politics blocked a Lincoln victory. Davis actually approached Bell, Breckinridge, and Douglas with the idea. Bell and Breckinridge agreed. Douglas refused. He would not be a party to Southern extremism. By late summer, the question was more about not who would win, but what would be the consequences. And they were dire. Of the four presidential candidates, only one defied tradition and canvassed the country. It was Douglas. He knew he could not win, but he wanted to rally all good Union men. And so, mustering all his steam, energy, he campaigned as we today might understand. He spoke at his birthplace, Brandon, Vermont, and conquered Boston, Portland, Providence, and other northeastern cities and sites. Believing Lincoln would win, he knew it would push deep south to secession. And that drove him to visit border states like Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. In Norfolk, Virginia, on August the 25th, on the steps of City Hall with 7,000 in attendance, he, after an impassioned address, was asked, "Mr. Douglas, should the South be justified in secession if Lincoln was elected?" To that he answered, "No." And to a second question, if the South secedes, would he advise Union resistance? And to that, an emphatic yes. That response brought a Southern storm of protest down upon his head. In Raleigh a few days later, Davis was even more emphatic when he said, "I would hang every man higher than Haman who would attempt to resist by force the execution of any provision of the Constitution which our fathers made and bequeathed to us." In Baltimore, he accused Alabama's Yancey and South Carolina's Robert Barnwell Rhett of conspiracy to split the nation. He said of them, "I am burying Southern disunionism and Northern abolitionism in the same grave." And he went on, "I wish to God we had an old hickory now, Jackson, now alive, in order that he might hang Northern and Southern traitors with the same gallows." In Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Douglas learned that the Republicans had swept the October state elections in swing state Pennsylvania. He turned to his secretary and said, "Mr. Lincoln is the next president. We must try to save the Union. I will go south." This time he meant the deep South. The travel and pace wore him out. Southern extremists condemned him savagely. Ruffians made personal threats, yet he still heard ovations in Memphis, Jackson, Tennessee, Nashville, and Chattanooga. There were even a few friendly faces in Georgia and Alabama. He addressed crowds in Atlanta and Macon. In Montgomery, Alabama, protesters tried to pelt him with fruit and eggs. But ever the political warrior, he still made a lengthy address from the steps of the state capitol. Meanwhile, Republicans felt they were destiny's child. They hammered at 8 years of Democratic corruption and pushed for issues that demanded attention. Though, with ranks filled with progressive minds and youthful reformers across the North, there were some chinks in their armor. Their moderate majority tried to distance themselves from abolitionists. And the party stressed certain platform planks dependent on where they were campaigning. In other words, in the Northwest, homesteading was the focus. In Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and in the Northeast, a protective tariff. A Pacific Railroad in the Mississippi Valley, and internal improvements promoted everywhere. And the party understood spectacle. Songs, emblems, salutes were developed, and Lincoln's wide awakes were remarkable. One of their marches never forgotten. It was in New York City, right down Broadway. 90,000 strong, well-trained crusaders, if you will, with rockets, Roman candles, and fireworks. And as one they sang, "Aren't you glad you joined the Republicans?" The parade was advertised as the Banners of Light, and it was stunning in its showmanship and impact. In the South, where paranoia reigned, this created sheer fear and defensive solidarity. So much so that in some areas, Minutemen were organized and militia armed. And with every northern state election in September and October, Southern fears increased, for Republican gubernatorial candidates were victorious in Maine, Vermont, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. Swing state victories in Pennsylvania and Indiana pushed quite a few Southerners from the Bell camp to Breckinridge. Finally, it came, Election Day. It was November the 6th, 1860, a day remarkably remembered, for there was no reported violence at the polls. Lincoln spent the day in the governor's room in the state capitol in Springfield. Around mid-afternoon, he left to go vote himself. At the polling site, he took a Republican ballot, modestly cut his own name from it, voted for others, then deposited his ballot. It took all of 5 minutes. By early evening, the news was reassuring from the Northwest, but what about the East? Just before 10, a telegram came in from Simon Cameron. It read, 70,000 Pennsylvania for you. New York safe. Glory enough. It was welcome news, but not official. Around midnight, just as he was seated at a ball where the ladies of Springfield had prepared a supper, a messenger exploded into the room. He announced the fusion ticket in New York City had received only 27,000 votes. It appeared New York would go to Lincoln. Shouts of "You're elected" shook the rafters. In the early hours of Wednesday the 7th, it was official. The mighty electoral plum of New York fell into Lincoln's basket. Once again, the room exploded with celebration. Lincoln said goodnight, and he went home the 16th President of the United States. Indeed, he had won 18 of 33 states and amassed 180 electoral votes, a majority of 57. Breckinridge carried 11 states, all slave, and received 72 electoral votes. John Bell, as expected, carried the border states of Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, collecting 39 votes. And Douglas, after all his effort, won only one state, Missouri, and collected only 12 electoral votes, 9 from Missouri and 3 from New Jersey, which split its electoral vote. In the popular mandate, Lincoln won with 1,866,452 votes. But he would be a minority president. Only 39.82%. 39.82% of the popular vote. The second lowest share of the popular vote for a winning candidate in the history of all presidential elections in these United States. Two statistical anomalies. Bell, Breckinridge, and Douglas's combined electoral vote totaled only 123. Not enough to deny Lincoln's win. And if the 3 popular votes were combined, Breckinridge, Bell, and Douglas, Lincoln would still have collected 169 electoral votes, far enough to elect him. Amazing, for one whose name did not appear on a ballot in 10 southern states and therefore did not receive a single vote in 1/3 of the states currently in the Union at that time. That election night, the man who worked the hardest, not only for his own candidacy, but for preserving the Union, was down in Mobile, Alabama. He spent Election Day quietly. After dinner, he sat in the office of the Mobile Register, watching, listening to the staccato telegraph dot and dash results. From the north and east, what he expected became reality. He would be beaten, and badly. The Southern extremists got what they wanted: cause for secession. As Douglas shuffled back to his quarters, which ironically was at the Battle Hotel, his secretary found him more hopeless than I have ever before seen him. A turbulent decade in which he, for far too long, had been in the eye of the storm, had taken its toll. His Union shattered, the little giant had only 7 months to live. Dead, June the 3rd, 1861, at the age of only 48. For Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, of the 4,680,529 total votes cast, and by the way, an 81.2% voter turnout, making the election of 1860 the greatest at that time and still the second most in history. 69% used their ballot to say that slavery should be restricted by Congress or possibly by local means through popular sovereignty. His election forced what had been building for over 2.5 centuries, and was clearly and cleanly expressed by the Richmond Examiner when it wrote, "A party founded on the single sentiment of hatred of African slavery is now the controlling power." 6 weeks later, South Carolina made good an earlier threat. On the 20th of December, 1860, it seceded. By the time Abraham Lincoln took office, 6 more had followed. Indeed, on the day Abraham Lincoln was elected, to those with eyes and ears attuned to the immediate future, there were distant sounds of drums and bugles. Abraham Lincoln was to be the 16th president of a disunited Union, chief executive at a time when a slow-burning fuse lit back in August of 1619, when the ship the White Line brought 20 African slaves ashore to Jamestown, Virginia. That fuse finally touched off a black powder charge that had been building for 241 years and resulted in 4 horrific years, which claimed some 700,000 lives. The day of his election, and with our American Civil War, all left us 130 years after the fact with similar issues that continue to simmer, continue to polarize this country, and like this great and terrible conflict, continue to bleed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn on my microphone now. Thank you, Freddie. That was a dramatic summary of an incredible year. It makes our conventions look pretty calm in 2020.
Does it not?
But we now have some questions that have started coming in, and I remind our audience that you may continue to submit questions through the Q&A icon on your Zoom. The first question is coming in from Paul Connick. He asked about the Republican convention. Was there a concerted effort by the states from the Deep South to withhold delegates from the convention, the Republican convention? Who controlled whether delegates would be sent? Was it possible? Were there any Republicans in the South who could have sent delegates to the Republican convention?
A great question. As I made mention during the presentation, there was one bogus group from Texas there were a few border states who had great concern for what might be coming down the road for politically, economically, and what would prove to be militarily. They would be caught in the middle. But no, there really was not that much of a concerted effort by those states of the Deep South and some of the Upper South to be a party to what they firmly believed was going to be the selection of a candidate who was going to be diametrically opposed to their political and economic well-being.
That's interesting because in 2020, even the bluest states have Republicans who go to conventions, and even the reddest states have Democrats. But by 1860, that wasn't happening.
The bitterness, Lloyd, was so deep, and Paul, it was so severe. And keep in mind, those delegates from the Deep South, despite the presence of Unionists all across the American South, they wanted to see Mr. Lincoln elected. They wanted to see the Republican Party succeed because it would give them nothing more than the justifiable excuse within their own mind to do what they wanted to do all along, and that was to secede and form their own nation.
But if you lived in North Carolina in 1860, you couldn't even vote for Lincoln because he wasn't on the ballot. Yeah.
That is correct.
Okay, we have a question now from William Walker, Bill Walker. How did the Democratic Republican Party of 1800 become the Republican Party of 1860?
Well, I should ask you, Professor Lloyd, to come up and join me with that one. So the question of how the Democratic Republican Party of 1800 transformed into the Democratic Party? Okay.
I guess the short answer is it didn't.
It's a different entity. The Democratic Party usually attributes its founding fathers as Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson. But more practically, we would tend probably to think more of Andrew Jackson and his role in forming what today we would consider the Democratic Party. The Democratic Republicans were nothing more, if you will, than an opposition party to essentially the Federalist. And they too, those two political entities, waged political battle until essentially after the War of 1812, in which it was discovered that the Federalists had been a party to the Hartford Convention, may have withheld efforts to win the war, may have indeed suggested possible secession, tired already of Southern domination of politics. That Democratic Republican Party essentially was the only truly united party by the time we got to 1820, and that resulted in 4 presidential candidates. And I'm sorry, it's 1824, that were 4 presidential candidates representing essentially 4 geographically different areas. William Crawford represented the Southeast, Henry Clay represented the West, Andrew Jackson, the Southwest, and John Quincy Adams, the Northeast. And because of those 4 candidates, the Democratic Republicans became a party to breaking up and to losing its unity, thus creating the foundation for what would come in the late 1820s and particularly in the early 1830s for what we would know as the Democratic Party.
Okay, thank you. So the Republican Party itself was not founded till the 1850s, and it had a different lineage.
And that's correct. The Republican Party was founded and ran its first election in 1856, and it was a collection of Northern Whigs, dissatisfied Northern Democrats, and those folks got together and rallied behind what would be not only blocking the extension of slavery, but an effort to blunt the dominance of the South, who had been particularly dominating of the federal government system up until that time.
Okay, thank you. This is another question about the ballot. Were Lincoln and Douglas on the ballot in any slaveholding state? And similarly, were Bell and Breckinridge on the ballot in the North?
Yes. There were some locales where, in some states, particularly upper South, and perhaps throughout the North, where there would be a fair representation. But the issue of Mr. Lincoln being included on the ballot was more a sticking issue for those elements in the American South, and particularly those 10 southern states. Now, once you got into the border states, and a border state was a slave state that went across the belt, if you will, of our nation: Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Tennessee. You could even call North Carolina to a certain degree, Arkansas to a degree. Those border states, also including Kentucky, yes, they would have been more likely to have had a more democratic ballot, something that would be used to what we would experience.
Okay. So there were some states, especially in the borderland region, that had
Correct.
all the candidates. This is a question actually from Max Orr about whether this election in some way influenced the patterns of later elections. How did the election of 1860 influence the election of 1864? Were there Democratic candidates on the ballot in 1864 from the North?
Well, of course, there are 11 states that formed the Confederacy that were absent from the 1864 ballot, unless there were pockets of Union occupation, particularly along the coast of South Carolina, down in Louisiana, up in portions of Tennessee. And for that matter, Union soldiers were able to vote in that election in 1864. So down into Virginia, with Sherman and his army as they pushed their way into the Deep South. So you can discount most of the 8 or 9 million folks that comprise the Confederacy. And it is interesting, the Democrats in 1864, predominantly those of the North, ran a platform and a campaign that was dedicated to trying to find an honorable way to get out of the war. Too much sacrifice, no end in sight. They encouraged George Brenton McClellan, who had been a burr under Mr. Lincoln's saddle for quite some time. McClellan being so very cautious to prosecute the war, and in fact, a Democrat who was very soft on slavery. But the Democrats thought that his marquee name would make him a viable candidate for running in 1864. And as late as August of that year, Mr. Lincoln himself was not certain that the nation was exhausted to the point that it wanted a change, that it wanted to get out of the war. In August of 1864, he wrote a note, sealed it, had his entire cabinet signed, so that afterwards, when opened, it would have committed them to a peaceful, smooth transition of power to a new president after the election. Of course, that did not come to pass. But Mr. Lincoln did not think he was going to win. He was fairly certain he was going to be able to win in 1860. 1864 was another matter. Now, 2 military victories allowed Mr. Lincoln to have the momentum to win, and to win decisively. Mobile Bay. The Battle of David Farragut, capturing Mobile Bay down in Alabama along the Gulf in early August. And then, of course, on September the 2nd, 1864, just months away from the election, Atlanta fell. And as William Sherman so telegraphed, Atlanta is ours and fairly won. Those 2 military victories pushed Mr. Lincoln's momentum so great that he would win the popular vote. He would win the popular vote from soldiers in the field. And George McClellan proved to be a candidate for the Democrats, asked to push for a platform that suggested ending the war honorably. He could not bring himself to support that platform because he realized, even George Brenton McClellan, that by doing so, he would have been saying that all those lives, even under his command, would have been lost in vain. And so between party and candidate, there was a great disharmony. Mr. Lincoln won popular, and he won decisively electorally.
And the soldiers voted by mail, I guess we could point that out, and
Yes.
they went for Mr. Lincoln. They probably saw that issue, like we've been fighting all this time. Yeah.
There is no question.
So here are a couple of, we have several more questions. One from Kathy Kuykendall. Did either of the two additional parties that ran in 1860, did they ever exist in future elections?
Well, no, because in fact, Kathy, thank you for your question. The Democrats split. So there were Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats. So that took care of itself in 1864, and then on as we progressed in our presidential elections, there was a Democratic Party. The Constitutional Union Party was a one and done, so to speak. It never again was able to pull together anything that would be of any kind of political momentum. And to be quite honest, the circumstances were not such that one should have been formed. Now, of course, third-party elections have been a major, major part of almost every election we have ever had. In the election that Suzanne will talk about next, the election of 1968, of course, many of us will remember the American Party and George Wallace and the effects of his candidacy, how it played upon, particularly the Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey. So Democrats would heel and try to run a united campaign from 64 and on. The Constitutional Unionists were done, and it was a one-time only circumstance for them in 1860.
Okay, here's a question about foreign views of the election. How did Great Britain view this election in 1860? This is from Jerry Everhart. And did the British attempt to influence the election in any way from across the Atlantic?
That's a great question and a most timely one, is it not? Thank you for asking that question. There's no question Great Britain was interested, as well as France and others, because at stake, particularly for France and Great Britain, there was the issue of Southern cotton. The vast majority of Southern export, or for national export in 1860, 57% was Southern cotton. Even to the point that cotton was so important to New York City and its economy that its mayor, upon secession by the Deep South, called a meeting of his council and suggested New York City form its own independent entity so that they might be able to keep the channels open to be able to trade with both North and South. Yes, Great Britain and France were very interested. They had very astute observers who were watching and monitoring not only from the European continent, but with their ambassadors and staffs here in Washington City and up and down the East Coast, as to whether they were able to affect to any great significance, or to any iota, if you will, to change the election, to cast doubts or aspersions. We don't have record of anything, simply because, regardless of how they felt, at that time, because of the technology, they simply would not have had the means. Could they write editorials in London? Could they write editorials in Paris? Indeed, but nothing like what we would anticipate in today's time.
They didn't have Facebook and the Twitter to work with, did they?
Exactly.
So we're coming toward the end of our time, but two quick questions. I'll just throw them both out. Was there any state in the Confederacy that was not dependent on slave labor as for its economy? And did West Virginia split from Virginia on the basis of slavery?
Great question. You can think of the influence of slavery between Deep South and Upper South. And there's a reason why there were 2 rounds of secession. The Deep South went 7 states and were a part of a new Confederate nation by the time, as we mentioned, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated president in early March of 1861. There is no question that their economies depended heavily on the institution of slavery. In fact, the first 2 states to secede, South Carolina and Mississippi, both those states, according to the 1860 census, had more slaves than they did white citizens. Now, as you go up to the Upper South, there is a reason why several states waited, prayed, hoped there might be some compromise, some averting, if you will, of disaster that seemed so imminent. And North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas. Once Mr. Lincoln called for 75,000 3-month volunteers after Fort Sumter had been fired upon, those 4 upper southern states went, we cannot abide by a president trampling upon the powers of the Constitution as it then was interpreted. And that pushed them over the edge. So yes, in North Carolina, Virginia, slavery was more tidewater or eastern oriented. And the more you moved to the west, the more the slave numbers would drop. And therefore there would be a different form of opinion about supporting a confederacy or supporting secession. For Arkansas, it would have been in the north. It would have been in Tennessee, the eastern portion of Tennessee. And so that's a great question, because I want to emphasize, we too often think of the monolithic North and the monolithic South during the American Civil War. And that is nothing. That is the farthest thing from the truth. That cannot be in any way anything that exists. There was, let me put it this way. In the South, in the Confederacy, there was a situation where we could abide by this, that Southerners made lousy Confederates. So yes, those circumstances, very much so. That's why you would have Western North Carolina and Western Virginia being, in many instances, anti-Confederate. And that is, of course, the latter part of your question. Yes, that is exactly why those 35 or 36 counties in Western Virginia seceded and therefore became a part of what would become the United States. They would come into the Union in June of 1863. And in fact, they are the last state that came into the Union east of the Mississippi River.
Okay, so that's something that has a legacy all the way down till today. We have a few more questions, but I'm concerned that we're coming to the end of our time, and I want to make sure that we have time to wrap it up. This is a very brief question. Did Congressman Burton Craig, a UNC graduate, play a role in North Carolina's secession from the Union?
Yes, he did. The Craigs helped to, if you will, oversee, drive home secession, and in fact had powerful positions within North Carolina's secession convention. North Carolina did overturn its first round for a secession convention. North Carolina in 1860 had about 1 million citizens, and in the statewide decision referendum to decide on a secession convention, it was voted down by a narrow margin in February of 1861. And then with Lincoln's call, the secession convention was called, and the Craigs were most prominent.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and we'll come back to some of these issues when we have our panel discussion on Thursday, including the question of whether this was the most polarized election in all of U.S. history. You sort of suggested that it was. Let me wrap this up just by reminding everyone that we'll be having another session tomorrow at 5:30 with Suzanne Globetti. And now I want, on 1968, and now I want to turn it back to Freddie for a final concluding comment, and then we'll adjourn.
Thank you, Lloyd. I heartily enjoyed this opportunity and appreciate being a part. But I want to set the stage, if you will, for our next presentation, and that will be tomorrow with Suzanne Globetti. In 1860, Southern extremists helped to sabotage the Democratic Party and thus ensured Abraham Lincoln's election and paved the way to their slide to secession and civil war. They got what they wanted, and then politically, economically, and militarily paid most dearly the consequences. How incredibly interesting, in that election of 1860, there was a divided nation, North versus South. In 1968, it is interesting that the Republican Party wooed the South by employing a Southern strategy, which was designed to appeal to conservative white Southerners. My goodness, in 108 years, how far the pendulum had swung. I hope you'll join us for the Humanities and its presentation tomorrow with Suzanne Globetti for the election of 1968. Thank you again.
Thank you, Freddie, and thanks to all of you for joining us, and we'll see you tomorrow.